Is it going to be a Trump century, or is Donald Trump a one-off in our politics?
Well, that's one of the big questions. Is he going to tear up 70 years of building a system that we've seen since 1945, or is he going to wind up reinforcing it? And at this stage, it's an open question. Too soon to tell.
Tell me, within your classic textbook, where the judicial branch fits in. Is there a power and is there an independence of an American judicial branch?
Well, there is, and that's one of the reasons that some people who are alarmists and say, oh, you know, Trump is like Mussolini. My answer to that is no, not at all, because the United States is not like Italy in 1922. We have separation of powers and a strong independent judicial branch, and we just saw it this past weekend with the, past week with the executive order. So the United States has the benefit of a long tradition of strong institutions.
Professor Nye, speak to Bloomberg's global audience right now as they look at an America in turmoil. Is it another part of our history, say the election of 1800 and Adams and Jefferson, or should there be real concern about the stability of America as the dominant institution?
I still think the United States is a pretty robust society with pretty strong institutions. Think back to the 1960s when you had rioting in the streets, a set of assassinations, deep bitterness over both civil rights and the Vietnam War. We're not in that kind of a situation today. We're in better shape despite our differences.
But, Professor, how much will Donald Trump, your president, actually test these institutions? You talk about checks and balances. How far will he go in trying to challenge them?
Well, I think if Trump were to challenge the institutions in a serious way, as opposed to with tweets, which is what we've seen, where he tweeted against a judge who came down on a decision against him. But if he were to do something more serious than that, I think there'd be resistance not just in the Congress, but also in the rest of the judiciary and in civil society. So I think that he can indeed make life difficult for judges, but I don't think that he's in a position to corrupt or undermine the independence of the judiciary.
Professor, a lot of people were surprised with the rhetoric coming from President Trump in the last couple of weeks since his inauguration. Do you believe that actually what you see is what you get? He's so far just held very close to what he said in the campaign trail. He'll build a wall. He's talking about a wall. He said he'll ban immigration. That's what he's done. And so can we actually take his campaign and say that will be his first 100 days in power?
Well, certainly President Donald Trump has tried to demonstrate to his followers, that his base supporters, that he is doing what he said. And that explains the executive orders, some of which were hasty and poorly thought through, as in the immigration order, and a lot of others which are primarily symbolic. In the sense that we don't know how they're going to work out. But he's wanted to use executive orders and tweets to show his base that he is carrying out what he said. And that's important to him because, remember, he was elected by a minority. He's got to energize that minority. And so rather than moving to the center, as let's say George W. Bush did after a close election in 2000, Trump has re-energized his base, or tried to do that.
Professor Nye, it was quite a moment last night when we saw President George Herbert Walker Bush and Mrs. Bush come out at the Super Bowl to toss the coin. That was a different time and place. Help me here with our less civilized discourse, this clash that we have, to borrow from Huntington, this clash that we have of less civilized discourse. How do we get back to normality?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, certainly Bush 41 was I think a period where we had a very strong foreign policy and a very civil discourse. And I think that technology has hurt this somewhat in the sense that in 140 characters, people can be quite rude. And the rhetoric of the 2016 campaign was pretty rough. The question is whether politicians will find it in their advantage to keep that way, or whether the people will say, you know, we'd like to hear a little bit more listening, a little bit more politeness. So it's possible that the pendulum will swing back. On the other hand, technology is not in our favor.
Professor, what is your prescription for the newly minted Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson? How should he act given the executiveness of the White House in its first 2 weeks?
Well, as I said on your program a couple of months ago, Tom, I think the Tillerson appointment is a good one. He knows what he's doing. He knows the world. He is going to have to deal with a White House which likes to act quickly, sometimes without carefully worked out consultations. And there is a long tradition of some tension between the State Department and the White House National Security Staff. Remember, Ronald Reagan ran through 6 NSC advisors. So I would expect we'll see a bit of friction there. I think the key for Tillerson is to keep a steady course on his own.
What about the friction within the GOP? Will the party, stay around and actually make sure that Donald Trump is in check, or will they rally behind him no matter what happens?
Well, I think in the short run, facing re-elections in 2018, a lot of the people who were critical of Donald Trump in 2016 are reluctant to abandon him. They think that they're going to be better off in their re-election if they stick with him. On the other hand, if part of what Donald Trump and Steve Bannon are doing is to try to organize a new populist party by appealing to the Tea Party Republicans and the so-called Reagan Democrats, then a lot of the middle-of-the-road Republicans or moderate conservative Republicans are going to feel that pressure. So the next 2 years is going to see a good deal of tension just under the surface.
And, Professor, what are the chances of a real trade war between the U.S. and China this year?
Well, I hope that calm voices will prevail. A trade war would be expensive for China, but it would be expensive for the United States as well. And if you're trying to provide jobs, it's worth remembering that our exports also provide jobs. So I think that it's a bad idea, but if you ask me to place a bet on will there be some, I would expect there will be some.
Professor Nye, the speed of events right now is unthinkable for anybody of any generation, but one feature here was the president's discussion with Mr. O'Reilly over at Fox News, where he showed a great affection for Russia and for Mr. Putin. Mr. O'Reilly called Mr. Putin, I believe, a killer. But far more important is this idea, is America so innocent? Explain to us how a president speaks of the innocent or guilt of America and our history.
Well, I was surprised by President Trump's remarks. First of all, I think it was Vice President Pence who said, or somebody on the administration said, no, I guess it was Mitch McConnell who said that remember that Trump is ex-KGB, and this guy is pretty much of a thug in terms of what he's done to his neighbors in Ukraine, Georgia, and elsewhere. And yes, you can dredge up things from American history where some of our behavior has not been exemplary. But it's surprising to see a president talk that way, particularly at a time when we're going to have to, and he is going to have to, deal with Putin to try to prevent Putin from doing what he did, which was invade his neighbor Ukraine and interfere in the American elections.